We're going to start with the Mishnah on Daf Sadihei Amud Beis, which is about 7 lines down from the top. The Mishnah says regarding a kli, a vessel that was used to cook the meat of a karban, echad shebishal bo ve'echad she'ira letocho roseach. It doesn't matter whether the vessel was cooked in directly, meaning the meat was directly in the vessel, or if, let's say, you cooked the meat in one vessel and then you poured it while it was hot and it has a liquid substance into a second vessel. Echad kodshe kodsh ve'echad kodshe kalim. The Torah requires what's called marika ushtifa. And we'll see exactly what those two words mean, whether it's cold water, hot water, etc., etc. But basically, it's not enough just to subject the kli to some sort of process of hagola, of putting into boiling water, but in addition, you need two things which the Torah requires called marika ushtifa, some sort of rinsing or purging process. And the Mishnah quotes a machlokas here between Reb Shimon and the Tanna Kama. According to the Tanna Kama, even in the case of kodshim kalim, which would include, let's say, shlomim, you, after having cooked in this vessel, we'll see what that vessel is made of, kodshim kalim, the Tanna Kama holds that too is included in the parasha Mariku Shtifa, whereas Reb Shimon says, kodshim kalim ein te'una Mariku Shtifa, he has a special miyut to exclude kodshim kalim, and therefore there's no mitzvah, no requirement of Mariku Shtifa. Now, with regard to truma, which is on a lower level of kedusha than kodshim kalim, everybody agrees. Even the Tanna Kama would agree you don't need marika shtifa if you cooked in a pot truma. Now you want to use the pot for chulin. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Bryce asher tevushal bo, and in the parsha here of what's called shviras kli cheres, which means that if you cooked in an earthenware pot, and now you want to use it for chulin, then the Torah says im bekli cheres tevushal yishover, it has to be broken. Ainli el shabishal bo, but the Torah is talking about where you cooked. However, iro letocho roseach minayin. How do we know that irui, which means pouring from one kli, boiling hot stuff into another kli, is as if you had boiled directly in the second kli? Talmud lomar asher tevushal bo yishover. Now, this halacha that you require shvira in a kli cheres, in a case of irui, is a special halacha with regard to shviras kli cheres. It does not apply in general beyond the bounds of kodshim, so that if in general you cook, let's say, milk in a pot, and then you poured boiling hot water, which had in it meat, liquid meat, broth, into that same pot, then you would not have to be shover the pot. You could just, what's the word I'm looking for? You could subject it to hagola, to a process of hechsher. But this is a special halacha in kodshim and the kli asher tevushal bo yishover. Boy Ron Bar Chama, the question was asked the following: Abishal ubilua hu dekapid rachmana. When the Torah required marika shtifa, was this required marika shtifa limited to a case where you cooked whatever you cooked? Let's say it's basar kodshim, and you cooked it while, obviously cooking means it's very hot. O dilma abishal below bilua. What happens in a case where, although the Torah speaks about cooking, but do we assume that the cooking also had a balua, that the kli, the vessel in which you cooked, was bolea, it absorbed the tam? But what about a case where there was no absorption of tam. Now, what would be a case where you cooked in a pot and there was no bilua? If you take a look at the statement of Rava, Amar Rava Tashma, Echad Shebishal Bo ve'Echad She'ira L'tocho Roseach. So it would seem that the way our Mishnah is formulating this requirement of Mariku Shtifa, it applies even Ira L'tocho. So therefore, it would seem that you don't really need Bilua. In other words, at this point in the presentation of the Shaklavataria, the give and take in the Gemara, Rava seems to be assuming that Irui is not Mavashel. Or I should say it may be different. Maybe Irui is considered Bishul, but it's not Balua. There's no Blia. So the Gemara says that you have no proof, Rava, from our Mishnah, because Bilua below Bishul, lo kamrinanle. I never had a suffix about a case of Irui, because in case of Irui, that's not considered Bishul. And the Torah says, right, Bishul Bo, only if he cooked in it. And Irui, pouring hot water into it, or hot liquid substance, is not Bishul. Ki kami boile, what was our suffix? Where there was Bishul, but below Bilua Mai. So again, we're still trying to figure out exactly what would be the case without absorption. That the Gemara thinks there was no balua and therefore there's no requirement of mariko shtifa. And we're not talking about a case of irui, because in the case of irui, that's not bishal at all. So it certainly doesn't require shvira klisha bushal though. Okay, now again, we're not sure of the mitzius here, where there would be bishal without balua. But let's see if the Gemara clarifies this a little bit later on. Toshma, the Omer of Nachman, Omer Rab Bar Vuach, Tanur Shel Migdash Shel Mateches Hoya. Now, there are two types of ovens. There's an oven that's made of metal, and there's an oven that's made of earthenware. And in the Migdash, according to Rav Nachman, the Tanu, the oven, was made of metal, not of earthenware. The isal kedaitoch bishul below bilua lo kapid. Why did they have to make the ovens out of metal if you're going to tell me that in a case where there was bishul, but there was no balua, then you don't need mariku shtifa. You don't need this whole process of purging it of its tam because there was no balua. Is that nevid shel cheres? Right, the difference is that cheres, earthenware, absorbs into the very fabric of the kli. So the fact that in the Beis Hamikdash they avoided a tanur that was made of cheres, of earthenware, which I guess was the more, at that time, more classic stove or oven, is because even in the case of bishul below balua, you would require shvira, and that would require you to break down the oven. So the Gemara rejects it. The Gemara says, "Keva de ika shiori menochos tafiyasa betanur v'ika bishul ubilua avdinan shel mateches." The reason why they used dafka metals to make their ovens in the Beis Hamikdash is because of shiori menochos. Right? If you have shiorim of menachos, which is nechal al yidei kohanim, and if you go ahead and you bake it in the oven, then there'll be both bilua, bishul, and bilua. So therefore, they made the tanur out of metal. Now we're about to embark upon the main sugya for today, and that is milchiks and fleishiks, meaning when you use an oven and you put dough in the oven to bake the bread, the inside of the oven is very often smeared with, let's say, animal fats, which are fleshik. And hahu tanura de atchu tichaya. They greased and coated the inside of the oven with alia. Tichaya. Tichaya means some sort of animal fat. Asra rababari loy lemichla l'riftal. Any bread that was baked in that oven, which now becomes fleshik of bread, is prohibited forever and ever. Vafil b'milcha. You can't even eat it as plain bread with salt. Because Dilma were afraid, Asi lemichle bekusa, he might take this bread and eat it with milchiks. Kuscha is a kind of a dip that was made out of yogurt. So it seems that Rabbah holds that when you use the oven on one occasion for fleishiks, you can never use that oven again. No, I'm sorry, I went too far. When you use the oven for fleishiks, then the bread that was baked in that oven could never be used again. Meisvei, the Gemara challenges Rabbah from a brisa, Ein loshen es ha'isa bechalav. We don't add milk to the dough to make a milchika bread, v'im lush, and if he went ahead and he did so, kol hapas kula surah v'nei hergel aver, we're afraid that he might come to eat this bread in a fleshika meal. Kayotzi bo ein toshen es hatanur be'alya. We don't grease the inside of the oven with alya's kind of the tail, the fatty tail of a sheep. V'imtosh kol pas kula surah. Now, again, the fact that the pas is asura because it's now a fleshka pas, that doesn't bother me. But it says achi yasik es hatanur until he fires up the oven. So it seems that firing up the oven would now be machshir the oven, and you could use it henceforth for whatever you want to use it for. Is chuvta de Rabba Barilah. Of Rabba Barilah doesn't allow you to bake any bread in this oven that was greased with fleshiks. And yet this price indicates that you fire up the oven and then you remove the fat. And anytime subsequently you bake bread in that oven, it will be a parva bread, and you can use it. Whereas Rabbah seems to assume that forever and ever, when you bake in that oven, even after it was fired up, the bread that you bake is prohibited. Tiyuvta. The Gemara says this refutes Rabbah bar Eloi, because the implication of Rabbah bar Eloi is that once you use the oven on one occasion with fatty substance greased inside the oven, you can never ever use the oven again. Because anytime you bake bread in that oven, the bread is going to be awesome. Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi v'chimiacha di sosiv Rabbah bar Eloi. Once we have upshlag Rabbah. Amai Omer Rav. Why did Rav say Kederis b'Pesach Yishavru? If you have earthenware, cheres, that was used with chametz the whole year round, now when it comes to Pesach, you have to destroy it. Why? Because the vessel has absorbed the taste of chametz. So why don't we say the following, that just like we said before, if you grease the oven and you have to fire it up, why not say the same thing? Let's just fire up the oven in which you bake chametz during the entire year. Why does Rav say that you have to break the oven as a result of the bilua of chametz? Amalei Rav Muki le hahi b'shal mateches. Rav, if you notice, is talking about kederos that are made of earthenware. The Bryce, on the other hand, is talking about metal kederos. Or, to be more precise, an oven that was made of metal. So if the oven was made of metal, then it's perfectly fine to fire up the oven, and that's called libun, and that cleanses and purges it of any bilua, of isur, or milk, or meat. But in the case of kideros, which are made of cheres, we have a principle that kli cheres yotzimi de daf yoliola, which means that you can never really purge a earthenware. It's so porous, it has so many openings to it that that absorption you can never get rid of. So it doesn't help if you would burn it, and therefore the chametz is in there. You got to get rid of it. Amalei. Rav Mukilea Hu B'Shelch. Yeah, Ibois Emo. The Gemara now gives another possible answer to reconcile the contradiction between the Brisa and Rav. Betanu Shel Cheres. Eino Chinami. You can purge that which is balua in earthenware. And if the oven is made of earthenware, then you could fire up the oven. So why does Rav say the Kederos B'Pesach Yishavru? Zeh hesiko mibifnim v'zeh hesiko mibachutz. We're differentiating now between ovens and pots. In the case of the pot, the fire is on the outside of the vessel. In the case of the oven, the fire is on the inside of the vessel. With regard to something where it's inside, then you fire it up, and the fire is bolea. That is soref. It just completely purges the taste of anything that was used inside the oven. And that's called kibolo kachpolto. But in the case of kideros, where the fire is on the outside, so what are you going to do? You're going to fire up the kli on the outside. But the problem is that once you cooked in that pot, the absorption goes through and through, and the inside of the pot also needs purging. So if you could have equated it with an oven and say, well, let's put the hot coals inside the pot. But what's going to happen to a pot if you put hot coals or you burn it with a brenner, a fire inside? It's going to get rude. So nobody wants to do it on the inside. They're going to do it on the outside. But as we said before, the balua is absorbed through and through the walls of the kli. The whole kli is completely absorbed of something that's prohibited. Even if we would allow him to do the firing up and the purging of its tam on the inside of the pot, he won't do it because he's afraid that he might break the pot from the heat on the inside. Hilkach, therefore, the Gemara concludes based on the Gemara that high kuvia, right? Kuvia is kind of like a pot that's made out of like a tile, has siko mibachutz. So even though it might be made of any substance whatsoever, but yet what's unique about it is that you burn the fire from the outside, not from the inside. Is asir. We're not going to allow you to be machshir if it has a bli of, let's say, milchiks or fleishiks or tarfus or whatever it might be, because even though the hesek is mibachutz, but nevertheless, since you will only burn it from the outside, we're afraid that you'll hesitate from burning it from the inside because you might break the entire tile ring.